Hello and welcome back for another edition of London Direct. We're going to focus on something slightly different now. A recent report by Oxfam said that the richest 1% in the world will own more than the rest by 2016. So is this right, and how did we get here? Well, I've been to the offices of the British charity to find out. So Oxfam have released a very interesting report about the disparity between the rich and the poor. Can you just run me through some of the headlines?
Yeah, so this is new research which shows that based on the data that Credit Suisse release each year, looking at global wealth trends, we're on course by this time next year to be in a world where 1% of people own more than the other 99% combined.
How on earth did we get here? Because it seems to be happening quickly.
Yeah, and it's been accelerating particularly this point around the percentage of wealth held by the very richest has been accelerating in the last 5 years or so. So essentially what we've seen is that what wealth has been created since the global financial crash has really disproportionately been going to the very wealthiest.
And is that because of central bank policy? Why are the rich benefiting so much?
Well, so of course it depends on what kinds of intervention central banks and governments have done, and it hasn't been the same everywhere. So where we've had huge injections of cash into economies, sometimes that has been spread more evenly, sometimes much less so, and too often I think what we've seen is it has further increased the value of assets already held by the wealthy, rather than creating better paid jobs for the majority.
Yes, so what about that other 99%? What's happening there, which is seeing their wealth eroded?
So again, the picture differs hugely, obviously, depending on where you look, and there's areas in the world where this is not the case, and Latin America would be the obvious case study of a region with historically very, very high levels of inequality, but where recently investment in minimum wages, in job creation, in more progressive taxation and so on has actually seen the gap narrow. But as you say, that's not what we've seen across most of the world, and in rich and poor countries, people are still very much feeling the pinch, and prices have gone up faster than wages in a lot of countries. We've seen obviously government policies in Europe, for instance, dominated by austerity, and that's something which impacts on those who are least insulated from it, which tends to be the poorest.
When I was looking through the Oxfam recommendations, I think there were 7. One of them was introducing a minimum wage. And it struck me there's a comparison with global warming, whereby you have Western countries telling other countries, you need to do this, this and this, which is okay for a developed economy, but for these developing economies, they can't put in these restrictions on the labour market. So isn't it going to be difficult to try and convince developing economies to adopt these measures?
Well, I think what we'd hope is that developing economies might look towards, as we say, for example, countries in Latin America where that's exactly what's being done. And the thing is, tackling inequality isn't bad for growth. It's the opposite, and it's a point that's been made by Christine Lagarde from the IMF. It's a point that's been made by the Bank of England. It's extreme inequality is really bad for economic stability and economic growth in the sort of medium or long term. So the motivation is certainly there for all governments to want to address this problem. Of course, richer countries have more resources at their disposal, but some of the other proposals we've talked about, which include changes made at a global level to tax, for instance, could make a big difference to poorer countries and give them some of the resources that they'd need to then invest in, for instance, their own job market.
Yeah, the tax is an interesting issue. Bill Gates has been talking about it today. He's in Europe. He's meeting Jean-Claude Juncker, who's the former Prime Minister of Luxembourg, whose tax policies are famous. Do you think that there's a real political will to try and tackle tax at an international level? Because it's the sort of issue that the politicians like to talk about, but when you've got someone like Jean-Claude Juncker who's presided over these tax laws in Luxembourg, it doesn't quite seem serious.
Well, as you say, we've heard a lot of the right words from a lot of people. We haven't, on a global level, seen enough action. In the UK, the current government has taken some really quite positive steps with a so-called Google tax introduced towards the end of last year, which, it still contains loopholes. They need to go further, but it's a step in the right direction. At a global level, the G20 has initiated a process with the OECD, which, again, in theory is a really positive step. The problem with that process is we see, for example, Luxembourg would be a good example. Luxembourg has a seat at the table, whereas a country like Sierra Leone that is now feeling the effects of the Ebola outbreak, and with a woefully underfunded health system. Well, if Sierra Leone wasn't losing vast sums each year from unpaid taxes from companies that have operations based there but who are not having to pay tax there, well, then they maybe would have been better placed to respond. So a system that allows Luxembourg a voice but excludes Sierra Leone, a system that continues to let the voices of multinational companies be heard much louder than the voices of the world's poorest, is not going to be the system that reforms global taxation in the way we need. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think our view would be there are some positive signs, but it's not enough, and there's a clear need for us to keep up with pressure.
Isn't in your suggestions? Isn't there an inbuilt assumption that governments are better than private individuals, or at least more effective in implementing these measures? But then again, I look at what's happening in US politics with this deadlock on Capitol Hill. I look at Transparency International's corruption index, and the developing world dominates that. So I'm wondering who's going to be the people or the authorities that are going to implement such ideas.
I think it can be a combination, and probably has to be a combination of governments and of the private sector and of civil society, all finding ways to work together. I mean, some of these are changes which need to be implemented by governments. It's up to government to set taxation policy, for instance. It's not up to individual businesses to decide how much they do or don't feel like paying in tax, or at least it shouldn't be. There are other areas where businesses absolutely could lead the way, and some have started doing so. So areas like minimum or living wages is a good example of where, as more businesses choose to adopt that as practice, governments will realise that there is a critical mass of support for those kind of policies, and it is perfectly feasible that governments will be the ones following behind at least sections of the private sector on that.
Thank you to everyone at Oxfam for giving me their time. Stay tuned to Doug's Copy TV for more interviews and analysis, but for now, goodbye.